Welcome back to my kitchen. What I wanted to teach you today is how easy it is to make your own homemade chicken broth. In our Cuban black beans and rice recipe, we needed 2 cups of broth, and I used homemade broth. And in that video, I told you how simple it was to make your own broth. But if you've never made it before, it can seem a little intimidating, but there's no reason to be intimidated by it. It's a very simple process, and it's one you can do with pretty much any ingredients that you have on hand. The first thing you need to have is a chicken carcass. And so I just smoked a chicken and I saved the carcass, and I'm going to use the bones and the cartilage and some of the skin of that and use it to make my chicken broth. So in addition to that, I also kept the neck, the chicken, and the organs that came in the inside of the chicken. I'm going to put those into my broth as well. And then I also have some assorted vegetables that I'm going to add in for flavor. And you'll notice that the vegetables I'm adding here are typically the ones, they're referred to as the Holy Trinity. It's what we put in the beginning of soups and all sorts of dishes: celery, carrots, and onion. And I happen to have a bunch of celery on hand that's a little bit past its prime. It was sort of getting a little wilted and not really something you wanted to crunch into because it wouldn't crunch. I was going to throw it out, but then I remembered that I was making this chicken, and so I hung on to it so that I could add it into my homemade broth. So all I have done at this point is I have scrubbed my veggies, gotten them nice and clean, and I've gathered the rest of my ingredients. And that is simply my chicken carcass. So I pulled all of the meat, or most of the meat, off of the chicken bones. I have some water, and then I have my stock pot here that I'm going to use for making my broth. And so to get started, I'm just going to show you, I've already scrubbed these veggies, and really you don't need to do any preparation. I will go ahead and cut off the ends, and then I'm just going to cut them in half here, and I'm going to put them right in the pot. I'm just going to do the same thing with some celery, cutting it into, I don't know, 4 or 5 inch pieces. We're just cutting it down to size, throwing that right in the pot as well. I'm not worried about celery leaves. They can go right in. I am cutting off any brown spots and putting those right in. I also had a shallot, and I'm just chopping that into big pieces, tossing that in as well. I had some leftover green onions from a recipe I was working on. Those are going to go in my pot as well. I'm just cutting the roots off. And here I'm just going to pull off any kind of wilted looking ends. Looking greens, I guess. And you give those a rough chop, and those are going in the pot as well. And the final thing that I'm going to add before putting my chicken bones is I have the neck and the organs that came in that little bag inside the chicken when I purchased it, and I'm going to add these to my broth as well. And this is an optional thing. This is just kind of how I utilize those. Everything is going to be strained out at the end, but I'm just going to go ahead and add those into the pot as well. Again, it's totally optional, up to you. I would just say, this is my personal opinion on this, because the liver is included in that. Our liver is our detoxifying organ, and that goes for animals as well. And because of that, I personally only do this if I feel pretty good about the environment that that animal was exposed to when it was alive. So this was a free-range organic chicken. I feel a little bit better about that than maybe just a conventional chicken purchased in the grocery store. So that is why I am adding those organs in at this point. If it was a chicken that I just purchased, just a regular chicken, I probably wouldn't add the organs in. But again, that's just a personal choice on my part. You certainly can. And then the last thing is I'm just going to add the chicken carcass. This is the cooked, what's left over from my cooked chicken. And I'm adding in the skin, and I'm adding the cartilage, any of the cartilage that is left over, any more little meat pieces, and of course the bones. It's all going in. And you can see there's sort of some gelatinous stuff. That's the collagen. And so I'm going to go ahead and put that in the pot as well, because I want that collagen in my broth. And what I'm actually going to end up making is more of a bone broth than just a regular chicken chicken broth, and the difference is how long I'm going to cook it. And I will end up cooking this for about 24 hours, really leaching out all of the minerals and good collagen that I can from this. So as you can see, this is just a pot full of my chicken leftovers, and as well as some celery, some onions, and some carrots. And to this, I'm simply going to add water. Typically, I would just take it over to my faucet and pour water. And what I do, this is me personally again, I add enough water to cover all of the ingredients inside. So I didn't have quite enough there. I'm going to add just a little bit more. Pour that in. And just a tiny bit more. So as you can see, with the amount of water that I've added to this, it's going to make a considerable amount of broth. And what I do after it's done cooking is that I will add it. I usually measure it into 2-cup quantities, and then I pour it in freezer bags and I freeze it. And then I always have it on hand to use when I'm making my own soups or other dishes that require chicken broth. We even heat it up. If somebody's feeling sick, we'll just heat it up in a mug and drink it. It's really tasty. If you don't have any of these veggies on hand, you just have the chicken bones after cooking a chicken, you can make broth with that. You don't have to have the additional things. It just helps to add a little bit more depth of flavor if you have them on hand. But as you can see, all I've done at this point is just covered it with water. And then I'm going to put a lid on it. I'm going to take it over to my stove. I will bring it to a boil and immediately turn it down to a simmer. And I'm just going to let it simmer on low for about 24 hours. And then it's going to be done. Okay, so at this point, it's been 24 hours that my broth has been simmering on low heat. If you'll remember, I brought it up to a boil and then I immediately turned it down to low and simmered. And I've been letting it simmer for 24 hours now. And what that's done is really pulled all the goodness out of the joints, the bones, all of the parts that I put into my broth. And we'll take a look at it now, and you'll see that it's developed a really rich color. I wish you could smell it. It's developed a really, really rich flavor. And then I'm just going to show you what I do to kind of deal with my broth, and that's it. It's a really simple process. It does take a little bit of time, but you don't have to attend it while it's simmering. You just have to let it simmer. And it's just that easy. We now have this beautiful, rich, dark, full of flavor, full of minerals, and it's got the collagen in it. This is some really rich broth, and it's going to be delicious added to soups or anything that might call for a little extra flavor from chicken broth. I'm going to put it in the refrigerator, let it cool a little bit before I bag it up. And as I mentioned, I usually put it in 2-cup, I put it up in freezer bags in 2-cup quantities, and then I freeze it flat and then stack those up in my freezer. And then I always have it on hand whenever I need some homemade broth. So this is a really very simple thing to do, very little hands-on time. Most of the time you're just letting it go on its own. If you don't want to cook a chicken on your own, it's no problem. Don't worry about it. Start with a rotisserie chicken. Buy a rotisserie chicken at the grocery store, save the bones, and do this with that. It's a great way to start making your own broth. You'll see how delicious it is, how much more flavor it has, and how nice it is to be able to control the amount of sodium that goes into your broth. So give this a try. Make some broth maybe before you try the Cuban black beans and rice recipe at home. You'll be glad you did.